In this, our final lecture for the Anthropology and World Problems class at Bloomsburg University, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the global and local solutions, as well as paths to sustainable futures that have been laid out by both anthropologists and others that have certainly considered many of these world problems and have confronted them in a variety of ways. Some of the big questions that hopefully the information presented here will allow you to go through, in addition to some of the other things that we talked about over the course of the semester as well. What are the potential alternatives to the current state of affairs? There are some that have suggested that there is no alternative to the current paradigm in terms of economics, distribution of wealth and income. This is in fact just the way that things are and will be the way that things will remain indefinitely into the future. And depending on where one is positioned within society, one can have very different outlooks on the current state of affairs, both in terms of politics as well as economics. So what is the outlook for the future? And this is something that we had considered very early in the semester in terms of your outlook for the future and the potential future of humanity as a whole. Many of these ideas about the future, of course, are held from a variety of sources, and the future is either somewhat optimistic, these ideas of utopian futures, or dystopian futures, very pessimistic futures. And indeed, one could argue, depending on one's social positioning, that we are in fact living in these worlds simultaneously, maybe not as individuals, but collectively as groups of people. What is the most pressing world problem today? We've considered a variety of these over the course of the semester. And indeed, how have world problems changed over time? In an absolute sense, how have they changed over time? And then also in terms of perspective, how is the way that these are looked at from a cultural perspective, from ethical perspective, from scientific perspective, how have these lenses by which human beings look at the world, how have these in fact modified collective as well as individual perceptions of world problems? How can we even understand or begin to understand or comprehend world problems? And we've talked about several world problems over the course of the semester, including social inequality along the lines of class, race, gender, how this impacts individuals in terms of poverty and wealth, in terms of access to various services of the state, in terms of education as well as healthcare, as well as police protection, going into our discussions of crime and punishment. We talked quite a bit about livelihoods, in particular focusing on issues of hunger, food security and insecurity, employment options, as well as migration. We talked quite a bit about issues of sustainability, particularly in terms of climate change, and as well the construction of parks in our lectures and discussions on approaches to the environment. Finally, we ended the class with discussion of war, terrorism, and weapons of mass destruction. And we looked at some of the intersections, indeed, between many of these different global or world problems over the course of the semester. So the question remains, what can or should be done and by whom? And at the individual level, I know that looking at these issues and these problems can seem somewhat overwhelming at times, and we might look on it and look at it as someone else's responsibility, this issue of the free rider problem. We might say that society, as the way it operates today, is actually quite satisfactory, that the state, various states, international actors, as well as corporations are engaging with these global problems and working to solve them through the use of technology to make for a better future for humanity. There are, of course, other actors that become involved both at the individual level as well as organizing within society in terms of social movements and non-government organizations, which we increasingly see a crossover from social movements to non-government organizations. And indeed, the professionalization of activism as a whole. And so what are some of the implications of that in terms of what can actually be done? So again, in the very beginning of the semester, I asked you for your outlook about the future, whether you were optimistic, somewhat optimistic, or going along the lines of more pessimism overall. And a lot of this has to do, I would argue, with how the future has been portrayed to you and how you've received it in a variety of different media. There are accounts of both dystopias as well as utopias. It seems to me that many of the popular movies, at least in terms of science fiction, go along the lines of a dystopian future. This is an imaginary place, well, supposedly an imaginary place, where people are unhappy and usually afraid because they are not treated fairly. Again, we see this in media, we see this in entertainment. Um, we see very early accounts of this in Razum's Universal Robots, which was a Czech play from the 1920s. You can see some images of that here, as well as probably famously George Orwell's 1984 that we discussed earlier in the class. And indeed, much of this class and a fair amount of writing in anthropology as well has been talked about, talks about dystopian futures, about the current state of affairs, the social inequality, how individuals within society are not treated fairly, at least in terms of class positions, race, access to health care, criminal justice system, etc. Not so much we've talked about the more sort of rosy approach, I suppose, a utopia. This has been defined also by Merriam-Webster Dictionary as an imaginary place in which the government laws and social conditions are perfect. It's often portrayed as this idealistic, again, rosy, rosy-colored glasses, and somehow indefinitely out of reach. So that is that individuals might be able to better imagine themselves living through in a dystopia rather than in a utopia. So there's this idea of general dissatisfaction, at least as we see in many popular media accounts, and indeed the recent show on Fox, the Utopia show on Fox, has probably shown a lot of the strife that exists in interpersonal conflicts in these supposedly created utopias overall. So who should act and who should be involved overall? We see if we place reliance upon corporate actors, this is what under Sachs's notion of sustainable development, and what he talks about is the contest perspective. And he talks about how this is something that has moved the notions of sustainability, sustainable development, and environmentalism really to the fore in terms of mainstream economics. And a lot of this has to do with consumer choice or things like fiduciary responsibility. And corporations are set up, they have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. So one path to get corporations to move towards more sustainable practices in terms of sourcing materials, dealing with waste, paying fair wages for their employees, as well as ensuring that their subcontractors are also meeting those very same conditions, is through shareholder activism, where shareholders will go to these meetings and will put forth amendments, suggest bylaws and ratifications and changes in order to shift the overall direction of the particular corporation. We also see within corporations a lot of movement towards more green initiatives. Probably one of the most well-known of these would be things like recycling, internal recycling, which of course have taken place over very long periods of time within corporations. And again, this not only makes environmental sense, but it also makes good business sense in terms of the overall economics, because a lot of the industrial recycling ends up saving money overall. And these practices have been in play even prior to any of the ecology movements in the United States in the 1960s and 70s. We also see a rise in consumer-oriented products, the marketing of particular products as organic, for example. And indeed, this is a connection between both the state as well as companies. And the organic standards were much contested within the United States by organic farmers. The at the time, there was some of the largest number of comments received by the USDA on these organic standards, revolving around things like including GMOs, including irradiation in food, and including the use of sludge in order to fertilize the products. And these were all eventually written out to a greater or lesser extent in the organic standards overall. But what the organic market has done is it's also created a new sense in consumers of this notion, and it ties into the idea of personal responsibility of individuals. And Julie Guthman, a geographer in California, talks about this in an article on alternative food institutions in California. This idea, if these people only knew how good the food was for them, then of course they would come out, they would support their local farmers, and they would be able to eat healthier. And we see here that this is supposedly this universal knowledge that just needs to be transmitted to people in order to overcome their ignorance, in order for them to be brought into the light and to be healthy overall. And so they need to be educated. And this becomes really important as we go throughout this lecture as well. In terms of social responsibility, we see initiatives such as fair trade, which are in many luxury goods, including clothing, coffee, and chocolate. The idea here is that there's a price premium that's paid by the consumer, and the increased in amount is then trickled down essentially to the farmers. Often the case is that these are not as neat in terms of their exchanges. There is some of the money which is eventually making it to farmers through the co-ops that they have to sell to for the larger amounts of coffee or chocolate, for example. And a lot of the money also goes into things like sourcing and certification to maintain the fair trade status overall. There's also been a lot of attacks from activists regarding so-called corporate initiatives to promote environmental and social sustainability. And this is the literature on greenwashing. A video link up on Bolt as well as on YouTube. This is a generic brand video, talks about the way that PR firms can manipulate the company image for both shareholders as well as the general public in order to convince both that the corporation is acting in the best interest of both the environment as a whole, as we understand it, as well as social responsibility, giving fair wages for individuals. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to move back and forth a little bit through a few ethnographic examples and talk on a couple different scales. And I'm going to begin in Nigeria with Paul Bohannon's work in 1955 on the TIV. And he was looking at a number of different things. He looked at both political and economic systems of the TIV. In this particular article, he looks at the TIV economy. In the TIV economy, historically, it was divided into three spheres of exchange. And Bohannon essentially lays out the argument that it is conceivable, hence, to organize the economy according to a moral hierarchy of values. That is, certain products in one sphere were more highly valued in a moral sense than those in another sphere. So not all of the values are equally exchangeable or commensurable with one another. That is, there are going to be social ramifications as you move through each one of these spheres of exchange. He also notes that with the penetration of the market system into TIV land in Nigeria, you see these moral differentiated economies essentially collapse down or collapse when they're incorporated into the realm of general purpose money, which is essentially the generalized interchangeability of all things utilizing a single metric. This also increased the opportunities for and the scope of unequal exchange. It further destabilized existing relationships within the society along the lines of a new metric and new sources of wealth, money rather than prestige, in the terms of the traditional ways of attaining that.